This next panel is set up pretty nicely by the discussion with the governors just about the Western United States, and some of the opportunities and certainly some of the barriers. When the Clean Power Plan was first proposed, I went to the Western governors and talked to them about the Center for the New Energy Economy actually convening states in the West. We wound up convening North Dakota and South Dakota, which aren't really part of the Western Governors Association, but wanted to be part of the convening, and it was 13 states, everything West. And after the Clean Power Plan was stayed, we went back to the Western states, and all except North Dakota and South Dakota, and we do a variety of things in the West from our center's perspective that have to do with trying to understand how to repower the West through this energy transition. Patrick Cummins is the moderator of this panel. He has a long history on the air side and the air regulation side, but he wound up as the executive director for the Western Climate Initiative, which is really California's cap and trade program, and I was fortunate to be able to lure him back to Colorado and to really run our program that involves repowering the West and the Clean Power Plan work that we've done before that. So Patrick is Colorado State University, Center for the New Energy Economy, and he's going to moderate the panel. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you all for being here. Very nice setup following that wonderful discussion with the governors. I certainly feel very privileged to be able to say I'm affiliated with Colorado State University when I come to this event because of all the wonderful things that are happening here. So I really do appreciate that and the opportunity to talk with all of you today. So as Governor Ritter mentioned, we started 3.5 years ago working with Western states, utilities, and stakeholders on the Clean Power Plan. And the reason why a regional approach to the Clean Power Plan was important is because we in Colorado are connected to a grid that encompasses 11 Western states. And power flows across that grid in many different ways from state to state and region to region across the West. And so when you consider how to achieve environmental objectives in the electricity sector in the West, you really need to be thinking on a regional basis. So we've had international conversations, global conversations, national conversations at this conference so far. Today, during this panel, what we're going to focus on is from a perspective of the West, the 11 states in the Western grid. And the Clean Power Plan was sort of short-lived because it was really more than 1.5 years ago that the Supreme Court put it on hold, and then of course it was is now in the process of being repealed by the administration. But what became clear immediately, and this was 1 year ago, February of 2016, when the Supreme Court put the Clean Power Plan on hold, is that the states and utilities and stakeholders we were working with said, look, we understand that this federal regulation may be going on hold, but these issues aren't going away. The issues around the energy transition that we've been hearing about and the necessity for companies, utilities specifically in this case, as well as states, to be thinking about how they're going to manage carbon is not going to go away just because of the problems with the federal Clean Power Plan. So as Governor Ritter said, we sort of rebranded that effort and are calling it Repowering the Western Economy. And the idea is to work with the same coalition of states, utilities, and stakeholders, environmental groups, clean energy advocates, to figure out how we can continue to make progress on decarbonizing the power supply in the Western U.S., as well as how we can begin to expand the use of electricity to power other energy end uses. Now, I'm not sure how the slides change here. We didn't get the AV briefing. Next slide. How about that? No, that didn't work. Okay, that worked. It's voice activated. Okay, so I'm just going to give a quick introduction here, and then we have a wonderful panel, and really it's just a great diversity of expertise here to go into these issues in more detail. We have to my right here Dr. Laura Nelson, who is the energy advisor for Utah Governor Gary Herbert, and also serves as the executive director of the Utah Governor's Office of Energy Development. Next to Laura is Jeff Ackerman. Jeff is currently the chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. And then to the right of Jeff is Kathy Willems. And Kathy is the senior vice president for environment and the chief environmental counsel at Berkshire Hathaway Energy. And Berkshire Hathaway Energy owns a number of utilities in the Midwest and across the West. And so they're going to talk about it. So we're going to hear from a major utility, we're going to hear from an energy regulator, and we're going to hear from a state energy planner. And I think that's going to be great. So I'm going to try to let them do most of the talking, but I'll set this up with a few slides. The first is just electricity generation trends on the Western grid. The amount of electricity generation peaked in 2008, right before the recession, and total generation across the Western grid has been flat since that time, as has generation from natural gas and hydro. We did see a big increase in natural gas up to 2008, but really over the last almost 10 years now, natural gas has kind of cycled up and down with hydro. In low hydro years, we get more gas and vice versa. But overall, those two sources of electricity in the West have remained relatively flat. Coal, on the other hand, has been down by 27%. Nuclear is down a little bit with the closure of a nuclear plant in California. And all of that reduction in coal has been made up by growth in renewables in the West. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is just showing generation on the Western grid from coal and renewables. Now, it's not a one-for-one. There's a lot of reasons that renewables are increasing and coal is decreasing. They're not, it's not just the interaction between those two sources, but it is interesting that with everything else being flat and coal declining, what we have seen is this very significant increase in renewables. This is wind, solar, geothermal over the last 10 years. Next slide, please. Now, this trend of decreasing coal generation is going to continue. As Governor Ritter mentioned on the last panel, the utilities in the West have already announced planned retirements for up to approximately half of the coal capacity on the Western grid in the next 10 years. And that's really only the first half of the story, because when you look at the coal units remaining on the Western grid after those are retired, what you see is if they retire, they're already quite old. And so if they retire at 50 years of age, we can expect up to 90% of the existing coal capacity in the West to retire by 2040. Now, one of the reasons for this, and I like to point this out, is that we went in the West from 1986 to 2006, a 20-year time period, and only built one coal unit. And then there was a little bit of a surge in some new coal units being built in the 2006 to 2010 timeframe. But we went for a very long time without building coal plants in the West. And so now they're effectively aging out, and of course, for a lot of different reasons, renewables are coming up. Okay, next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of carbon dioxide emissions? And I'm going to touch briefly on the Clean Power Plan. Carbon dioxide emissions from the power sector in the West also peaked in 2008. And since that time, they've decreased by 20%. And of course, as we've kind of beating the drum here, with planned coal unit retirements, we know that's going to continue. But not only that, there are a number of Western state policies and planned utility investments in renewables that are going to reinforce this trend towards lower emissions from the electricity sector in the West. And so when you look at the Clean Power Plan targets, which were state by state, but if you look at them on a Western regional basis, what you find is that the West as a region would actually will exceed the targets established in the Clean Power Plan. So if you, next slide, please. And this is a graph of that. So the red line down the middle is up to 2016. That's actual data. And then the line continues to the right down as you back out the planned coal retirement. So and this is actually probably conservative, but we do expect to see a continued decrease in carbon dioxide emissions from the electricity sector. So this is coal and natural gas. It's not just coal. And then the black line is where the cap would be under the Clean Power Plan for the West as a region. So you can see now, this isn't a Clean Power Plan panel, and we're not going to get into all that, but what we can say is that the West would be in very good shape. There are still a lot of reasons why the Clean Power Plan is important, would have been important, but the progress is going to continue regardless. Okay, next slide. So it's not, when we talk about a low-carbon economy or repowering the Western economy, it's not just about the electricity sector. And last year, there was sort of a big headline that said that on a national basis in the U.S., that for the first year, transportation emissions exceeded the electricity sector in terms of total CO2 emissions. That's old news in the West. In fact, in the West right now, the emissions from the transportation sector are about 1.6 times higher than in the transportation sector, are 1.6 times higher than in the electricity sector. And as we've seen, the electricity sector is going down, and transportation is flat to actually increasing in recent years. So last slide then. So one of the real issues is not just, when we talk about repowering the Western economy, it's not just about how we continue to make progress in the electricity sector, but it's also about more clean, affordable electricity to power other end uses, specifically, and maybe most importantly, transportation. The good news is that we have tremendous potential to increase renewable generation across the West, hydro in the Northwest, wind, solar in the Southwest. And one of the big questions is, how are Western states and companies going to work together to achieve that goal? And that is sort of the overall framing for what we're going to talk about here on the rest of this panel. So with that, we're going to start actually with Kathy and move this way. Thank you.
All right. Well, hopefully we can, the magic remote control. Thank you. And can we get the first slide since no, reverse order.
All right, we did not have our AV checkout, obviously. So we're probably looking for the second slide deck, which is Kathy Williams' slide deck. We're going to have Laura go last. If we can do that, if that's possible in this.
If not, we'll just pass down the remote.
Somebody out there. Okay.
There we go.
How about that?
All right.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Some of you heard discussion yesterday by myself. That was more of a personal nature. Today, I'm here to talk about Berkshire Hathaway Energy and what we've done. One of the items that really resonated with me from the governor's panel was that, we can't rely on what happens at the federal level to control our destiny. And I think within our organization, that really rings true. We plan on a long-term basis. We plan 10 years out. We even sometimes look 20 years out. And it is obvious that administrations can change and policies can change. But what we have to do when we're planning to meet our customer needs is to have good business plans in place that make sense for our customers and execute on those plans. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what those plans have been, what they look like moving forward, and a little bit about the company and how we structure things as we look to the future. So just kind of an overview of the company. As you can see, we've got a fairly significant presence in the West, but Berkshire Hathaway Energy, owned by Berkshire Hathaway Incorporated. We're the energy branch. There are 27 employees within Berkshire Hathaway Energy, so I'm one of them. I feel very privileged and honored to be part of that organization. We have very enlightened leadership, and as I talk through some of these issues, I think that you'll see that. All of our operating companies, while they're managed locally, operate under 6 core principles, and those principles include customer service, operational excellence, environmental respect, financial strength, regulatory integrity, and I'm missing one, employee commitment. So those are core to every piece of our operating companies. We've got about 11.6 million customers worldwide, 21,000 employees who work hard every day to make sure the lights do stay on. We have an excellent safety record, but we're always focused on safety as being one of the highest priorities of the organization, making sure that our employees go home every night in as good a condition as they showed up in the morning. Environmental respect is sort of my piece of the business currently, and we'll get into more detail about each of the individual operating companies, but currently about 39% of our energy is renewable, non-carbon generation. We have below average rates across the country. And we've been able to do a lot of things while keeping those rate structures in place and not seeking rate increases. And that's one of our core missions, is to not increase rates as we move along. So for purposes of sort of elaboration, I'll just go through the operating companies. Pacific Corp, some of you may be familiar with under that umbrella. We have 2 operating companies, Pacific Power, which operates in California, Oregon, and Washington, and Rocky Mountain Power in the interior West, in Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. NV Energy operates in Nevada, Mid-American Energy, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois. And then we have a renewables company that was formed back in the 2012 timeframe, and that's called BHE Renewables, really designed to serve the needs of states and utilities that were looking to expand their renewable portfolios. It's a non-regulated, sort of non-utility entity that builds out renewable projects and sells the output from those facilities to other entities. We also have 2 natural gas pipelines. One takes natural gas transmission pipelines, from natural gas from southwest Wyoming through Utah, Nevada, into California. We have Northern Natural Gas, which basically goes up the center of the country between Texas and Minnesota. We have a transmission company in Alberta, Canada called AltaLink. We also have operations, a distribution company in the UK, and a hydroelectric facility in the Philippines. So we're fairly dispersed, and that sometimes is an advantage and a disadvantage. So if we start at the West and we talk about PacifiCorp and those 2 operating companies I talked about, the diversity in the system is fairly obvious by the map between Wyoming and Utah and the coal-based resources that are there. A lot of mine mouth facilities, so you build where the resource is, and whether that's coal-based or whether that's wind, or in the Northwest, whether that's hydro. You see a lot of that come through in the way those companies or organizations generate electricity. A lot of transmission, that was another issue that was hit on by the governors, and the importance of transmission to get electricity from where the generation occurs and that resource is to the population centers. So for us, transmission is a very big component of, and a very expensive component of what we do. But the nice part about the way this system operates is, and it's also the disadvantage, is you've got 6 separate states and 6 separate states of utility commissioner type regulators who are all trying to figure out how to manage this process and try to come to agreement, which sometimes is rather difficult because all the assets, the generating assets, are operated on a system-wide basis. I talked a bit about BHE renewables. You can see the states in which those operations are located. They do have the largest solar projects in the world currently, based in California, almost 1,500 megawatts of capacity there. Wind is creeping up as we acquire additional wind generation facilities. We have a geothermal facility in Southern California, and then I already referenced the hydro facility in the Philippines. Yep, went too far. Mid-American Energy, it's sort of based in my home area in Iowa. You know, what I found remarkable among the governor's discussion was everybody bragging about wind, and I'd like to brag about wind too. Because even though other states have even better wind resources than Iowa, I think we have more in terms of actual physical in-the-ground steel and blades than most of the states, with the exception of Texas. Mid-American Energy Company, by the end of 2020, will have 95% of its retail customer load being able to be met on an average annual basis by renewable electricity. And that's powered by wind. Right now, there's about 4,000 megawatts. We're in the process of 2 major projects. One's called Wind 11. It's because we had Wind 1 through 10 in various tranches. We're on number 11 now. And that's increasing the size of the portfolio. But in addition, and I believe somebody referenced this yesterday, we're doing some wind repowering. And what that involves is taking the existing infrastructure, adding larger turbine blades, replacing those turbine blades, and getting anywhere from, depending on the exact location, but 19 to 29% greater output as a result of repowering or putting new larger blades on. Mid-American has a vision to meet 100% of its retail customer load with renewable generation. Now, how can we do that? No, we don't have big batteries or anything else, and it's not 100% of the time. You have to rely on backup generation. But it has to do with the fact that you've got what's called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, where we engage in sort of a pooling, if you will, of electricity, so we can push more wind out when we need to, and we can rely on other resources in the system to supply our needs when we don't have enough wind. We do have coal fuel generation. We've shut down some of our units thus far. So it's not that there's no fossil fuels in the equation, but it's pretty impressive to say that, you know, on an average annual basis, you can meet that much of your retail customer load with renewable generation. Pacific Corp also has a program that is in the process of being considered through its integrated resource plan called Energy Vision 2020, which would invest about $3.5 billion by 2020 to add 1,100 megawatts of wind generation, do some of that same repowering that I just talked about for our Iowa utility, and of course bring in the essential component of the transmission. Obviously, one of the key drivers currently is trying to minimize costs through being able to take advantage of the production tax credit for wind that will be expiring in 2020. The nice thing about this, the issue that was talked about by Governor Meade in particular about the declining tax base relative to resource extraction in Wyoming, a lot of that wind will be based in Wyoming, and it will help some of those rural economies expand tax base there, et cetera. So, we're trying to do something to help that situation, and I think it's an overall positive result. Yep. So, in closing, I think what you've heard through the past 2 days is that the energy sector is definitely in transition. We've already seen on multiple occasions and references that we're seeing decreasing or flat loads. So to a certain extent, the need for new generation is decreasing, but how do we change out that existing fleet to get cleaner and more responsive to customer needs? So that's one of the challenges that the sector in general is facing. Secondly, you've also heard discussion about natural gas prices and how that drives markets and influences ultimately the cost of energy and then what's in the dispatch order, because the lowest cost generation is going to dispatch first. What we've seen on our system is that we are utilizing our coal plants a lot less and driving those load factors down more significantly than we ever anticipated we would be able to. The cost of renewables have decreased significantly. You've heard that as a common theme. And of course, we touched on this as well. Customer needs and expectations are changing. When it comes to retailers, when it comes to technology sector, data centers, et cetera, they want renewable energy. They want 100% green. And my organization wants to be the one who can provide that to them. So we are, through things like Energy Vision 2020, through Wind 11 and Repowering, we are making a concerted effort to give customers what they want, what they need. And in the case of the Wind 11 and the Mid-American Energy 100% Vision, we're also not selling renewable energy credits. We are keeping those renewable energy credits on behalf of our customers and through a program called Green Advantage, allowing our customers to meet their sustainability goals by saying, ultimately, hopefully someday, that all of them will have 100% renewable energy. But in 2016, it was 48%. Each one of them, based on their electricity usage, can say that 48% of their electricity was renewable. So again, going back to the long-term view, the long-term vision, planning, et cetera, what are we doing? We're trying to develop the long-term sustainable energy solutions, regardless of who's in office, trying to implement our plans as we originally developed them. We're advancing innovation, trying to enhance efficiency and strengthen partnerships with all our stakeholders, whether that be our regulators, our communities, our customers. And then ultimately, the basis for our existence is to focus on delivering reliable, affordable, safe, and increasingly clean energy to our customers and reducing our carbon footprint.
Good afternoon. So I am Jeff Ackerman, and it's a pleasure to be with you on behalf of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. We'll get some slides set up in a minute. Also to share with you first, happy Halloween. I came of age when Ronald Reagan became president, just to put things in context, and we all share a collective history of living through what Ronald Reagan offered to the American storyline. And amongst many things, he really painted government in an interesting light, and regulation in particular in an interesting, not necessarily positive light. So I'm dressed today in the most scary thing I could be, and that's a regulator, I guess, too. So with that, as a regulator and as one of 3 regulators on the commission, I too have a disclaimer, and so that's my disclaimer. You can read it if you wish, but my point is that I speak for myself. I have one of my fellow commissioners with me. Commissioner Francis Consilia is with us today. So that makes 2/3 of the commission is with you here today. We all speak for ourselves. We don't speak for the commission. And we use our public process when we are together in a formal process is when we make our decisions and how we do our business. I actually hope in part of that, all kidding aside about regulation and about our process, is through a handful of slides to try and engage you differently and to think about regulation, which could be a yeoman's task, but it's worth taking on. Because I want you to think about regulation in the context of how the West is changing, how energy is changing, the role of regulation in that space, and in doing so, hopefully change your appreciation, and since we're sitting here in a university, hope that those folks that are on anywhere along their career path could actually see utility regulation as a very noble, worthwhile place to build your career. With that, one thing about regulation I want to touch base on is to show you a slide with 2 arrows. Is to talk to you about a key part of electric utility regulation as it relates to our conversation, and that is electric resource planning. We do a fair amount of electric resource planning as an integral part that we as regulators respond to where are the investor-owned electric utilities trying to go in terms of building out their resource base. And so we sit here in 2017 at sort of the intersection between utilities that some may think are rapidly changing, some may think aren't changing at all, but whatever, there is a sense of change in the utility industry. And that intersection is there's a feeling that regulation, it just always feels like it's trying to catch up with the utility, if not with itself, also is going through change. And one of the key parts of how we do a utility regulation of resource planning, this is where the utility tells us about their future outlook of load forecast and what kind of generation and how should we assess future generation bids as they come in to decide what is the right thing to buy and how much and how fast of what type and what mix, is to look at this through a lens, and this is also the value of speaking to you as a commissioner of one. I will keep things sort of purposely broad and prospective and stay away from any proceedings we have in front of the commission right now. But I want to touch upon scenario planning. Scenario planning that was first brought into business thinking in the 1970s by folks like Royal Dutch Shell as a way to look at uncertainty. And so we have the constant task of looking at uncertainty as we think about making or overseeing very sizable and long-standing investment decisions in electric resource generation. So one way to look at that is scenario planning. And so I just want to share with you some thoughts as one commissioner as to how we might look at the future here in Colorado and how it might apply to the West. And when you do scenario planning, you basically simplify it down, and this is sort of level 1 scenario planning, to 2 different spectra. And the first one that many people use when they're thinking about electric resources is obviously going to be load growth. And load growth can work from basically a sense that load growth in the future could be very low. If we see prices go up and we see price elasticity, that can have impact on load growth. If a continued improvement in demand-side management, whether that's utility-driven or the industries themselves putting better and more efficient products in the market, can push load growth down, or you can see load growth possibly go up as we start to explore new end uses that could be electrified, as we've talked a fair amount over the last day or so about vehicles. But there are many parts of the economy that could be electrified. So we live on that one spectrum as we try to decide what the future might hold. The other spectrum that I would choose for you to think about has to do with the rate of decarbonization. Over on the left end of that is sort of what I would claim is the current approach. We are moving along in Colorado and watching decarbonization happen, and it's moving at a certain pace, at a certain cost. You heard the governor make some references to the intersection between that rate and that cost, but that we are going to find ourselves somewhere along that horizontal spectrum as well, motivated by a variety of factors that we cannot necessarily cleanly predict, but we know is something's going to happen along that spectrum. So we could be at the left end watching sort of a ongoing pace, or who knows what could happen next beyond several hurricanes to finally have a clamoring to change the thinking and change policy and action along that, in that push to how fast you move toward a zero carbon state. So what you get when you do scenario planning then is you choose those, in this case I've chosen those 2 axes, and then what that shows you is what might the future hold. It's not a prediction of the future, but it's an overlay of your decision-making process to think about, as we make decisions, is it resilient against all the possible futures? So as you look at that, I'm going to take you back through that again and say, okay, if those are the possible futures, what you do is start talking about the different quadrants. You start probably down in the lower left quadrant, as I would say that's sort of where in Colorado we are right now. Fairly low growth, and we're moving at a fairly modest pace toward decarbonization. And that sort of reflects what's going on right now. There's a sense of what cost impact that's having on customers. There's a sense of how the investor-owned utilities are responding to that. Moving around clockwise, if we see an increase in load growth as things electrify more quickly, you could find ourselves in the upper left column or quadrant if we stayed on a similar pace toward decarbonization. But if we saw higher load growth, what that brings is more opportunity to bring on more resources faster. And you would see a transition in the portfolio by the new resources potentially being more and more renewable resources while the existing configuration stays the way it is. Continuing around to the upper right, what you could see over here is if there is an increased urgency, an increased, be that political groundswell, legislative change, economic change, whatever, this is the quadrant where you could see both incredible growth and at the same time a heightened sense of urgency to move toward more decarbonization. That's where you'll see us move from not just the changing mix over time, but you could see a push toward more retirement of resources. You could see this transition, of which we have some in the state, but you could see an acceleration of refocusing from coal to gas and more renewables. That could be that future. And then just continuing out the circle, if you were to see that same sense of political and economic urgency, but if load growth stayed low, this is an interesting scenario to look at as well, because what you have here is the push toward more renewables, but the push toward more renewables pushing other assets off the system faster, and that is going to have more pressure on rates then. And that's going to be the challenge in that quadrant, because with lower growth comes more pressure on rates. So I share that with you just as a one hypothetical way to both think differently about how resource planning, at least Colorado, as we toward the future, what might be out there. It's not to say that we're necessarily choosing any of these futures, but it's to say the future is likely somewhere in one of those four quadrants. And if we're making decisions that fall out of those four quadrants, that is at our peril. And and it doesn't necessarily mean that you put 25% of your chips on each quadrant equally as well, because that may kind of diminish the fact of just engaging the brain and other data and saying what else tells us that we might in fact be moving toward one quadrant more quickly than the other. But so that is a way to sort of think about, as we look at resource planning, as we look at where we are right now, how this might play out. But just to share a couple other thoughts with you, again, from the utility regulatory perspective, because there's a lot of detail. We could spend time sharing with you all the ins and outs of how we do electric resource planning, and a few of you might actually be interested in that. What I want to get to your attention is that as we think about that process of resource planning, as we look at load forecasting, as we go through our first phase where we set forth what are our most important variables, how are we going to model the bids that the utility brings in, how are we going to see portfolios brought forth to us before we go into that second phase and look at those portfolios, it is upon us as a commission, and why we are on the cusp right now of exploring rulemaking in 2018, to look at how to do this more effectively. And just a couple examples of that. First off, is we work, this current round, we're working with a 39-year planning horizon. It's an interesting, we worked in the states out west, and I think it was the Center for the New Energy Economy put forth some great data about this at a meeting half a year ago, showing that out here we move between states from probably 20 to 40-year horizons, and Colorado tends to be out on the longer end. It's an interesting thing to say, in 39 years, there's a good chance the electric utilities we're engaging are going to be a lot different than they are today. We need to figure out how that gets factored into the process. We also do load forecasting as the front end of this. Load forecasting up to now has been an effective work of good social scientists, economists, sociologists, looking at key data points of consumer prices and population growth and the like. I would call that sort of passive load forecasting. And I would say we're going to need to move toward active load forecasting as well, that says not only what is going to happen, but what would we like to happen? And where do we have an influence on that? Electric vehicles is a great example of that. What are how do we add into our thinking the possibility that different levers, whether it be at the commission or the legislature or the market, might move that to happen more quickly than what current data would tell you. How do you factor that into your load forecasting? Third, to my earlier point about that planning horizon, the utility so far sits and operates with a certain current model of how it does business, and everyone just refers to it as the utility business model. Whether or not it's incumbent upon the regulator to say, hey, come forth and tell us your new model, that makes everybody a little uncomfortable and is maybe not a productive use of the public space. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that that model is going to change in some form or fashion before the end of our planning period. How do we factor that into our decision making so that we're effective at not making investment decisions that then end up undercutting the evolution that's happening in the business model? And then modeling itself. We currently work with one very sophisticated model that brings all the data together of the key variables we've decided to look at on price on carbon, price on natural gas, ways to compare investor-owned versus third-party bids, ways to factor in a number of variables about dispatching of plants and the like. That's a great model, but I think we are getting into the world where we're going to need to either increase the sophistication of that model, or more likely, this is an exercise in an increasingly effective decision-making process. And that's possibly going to require multiple models, and going to require folks a lot smarter than I that hopefully are graduating now or soon out of universities like CSU that are going to move into this area and bring us a spectrum of models that are going to help us make better decisions in this space. And then we didn't talk about, but as well, this is going to be added compounded challenge as Colorado discusses through its investor-owned utilities joining an organized or a retail transmission market. That puts a whole new dynamic upon resource planning as well, and is both exciting and yet takes complicated decision making and makes it more complicated. And so it's not that we're not up for the challenge, but just wanted you to get a sense that is the real world work of regulation, why we look for good folks to help us both as intervening parties, our own staff, utilities themselves, that this is just, state-of-the-art decision-making is what we're trying to do here in a real-world contentious area of policy, economics, engineering, and law, and come up with good decisions. So with that, I appreciate being with you. That's how you can find out more about the State of Colorado's Public Utilities Commission.
The commissioner's giving me my technology training right now as we go. Okay, good afternoon, happy Halloween, all the niceties. It's really lovely to be here with all of you. I have to again thank Mari for the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much. And Patrick, it's always great to be with you and be on a panel. And somehow the commissioner and I often end up on panels together. So, and Kathy and I were on a panel yesterday talking about women in energy, and similar to Kathy, that was a little personal, and today it's a little bit about what's happening professionally. You've heard a lot about change. We've talked about the national landscape. I think you've even gotten a picture of what can occur globally, what's happening at the different state level, and I just think it is really important to recognize we are a region, and we act together and we get impacted together. So I am going to talk to you a little bit today about what's happening in Utah, and I think you'll see it is very reflective of what's going on in the region. So Patrick mentioned that I am the governor's energy advisor in Utah, and I also serve as the executive director of his energy office, and it's the energy Office of Energy Development. And so I do advise him on policy matters, but I'm also charged with planning, as Patrick mentioned, and really driving energy development in the state. A few years ago, there was a very comprehensive study that was done, not by my office, but by a group called Envision Utah, to understand what Utahns wanted with regard to their energy future. And it was the most comprehensive engagement with the public ever done, ever undertaken, with the most number of responses to a survey ever received on this issue. And so this is what Utahns want. They want to be self-sufficient when it comes to energy. They want it to be affordable, reliable, and clean. All the things that you heard Kathy talk about, what you've heard the commissioner talk about, and what you've heard others talk about during the conversation here at this event. And as we look at that, we really recognize that there is an important nexus between the decisions we make in our energy economy and what impacts our environment. Now, it's said, and I'm an economist, there's no free lunch, okay? So if we make choices, there are going to be impacts. But you also heard from Governor Meade today that it doesn't have to be a conflict between energy and the environment. So as we make those choices, we can create opportunities to realize both our energy goals and also make improvements to our environment while keeping energy costs low. And energy cost is an important consideration in Utah. We actually happen to be part of the Berkshire Hathaway family of businesses. We have one investor-owned utility in Utah, that's Rocky Mountain Power, provides roughly 83% of the electricity needed in Utah for our customers. The rest is provided by municipals and co-ops, also an important part of our energy mix. But overall, we have very low energy rates relative to the rest of the country. And not only does that drive new economic development, it's important to affordability in the state. When we have higher energy costs, it impacts the other things that we as households and customers are able to do, including considerations around healthcare and food. So we also are an energy exporting state. Energy is very critical to Utah's economy. It represents roughly 10% of our gross state product. And we have all forms of energy. Some of you, I know maybe you've heard me speak or heard me speak yesterday, and I said Utah is an all of the above state when it comes to energy. We look at all of our energy opportunities, whether they're conventional energy sources, oil, gas, and coal, or new opportunities around renewable energy systems. And of course, energy efficiency and conservation are critical. In fact, I had the opportunity formerly to work for Governor Huntsman. In 2005, we put forward one of the most aggressive, and I believe at the time, the most aggressive energy efficiency plans in the country. So energy is important to us. We're an energy exporter. It also provides key jobs and helps us to maintain affordability of energy in our state. So it just drives our goals all around and important outcomes for the state. But you've heard the landscape's changing. And we also heard that we have to be a bit flexible as this landscape changes. Utah recognizes the importance of a diverse energy portfolio in that flexibility. Less than a decade ago, Utah had renewables in the neighborhood of 0%. 2 years ago, it was maybe in the neighborhood of 1.5% to 2%. Just in 2 years, we've gone to 7% renewables in our energy mix. At the same time, over the last decade, we've gone from about 90% of our electricity being provided by coal to 68% being provided by coal, with natural gas and renewables predominantly making up the rest of that. Now, we've talked a lot about authors here, in particular Amory Lovins. But one of my favorite authors is Vaclav Smil. I don't know if you all have ever heard of him. If you haven't, I very much encourage you to pick up one of his books. But he writes, his first book was really a retrospective on energy, the history of energy, and our energy uses and sources are constantly changing. They change because of economic factors, they change because of cultural factors, and they change because of technical factors. And I think what you're seeing here in the changing Utah mix is some of all of that. Changing socioeconomic considerations when it comes to energy, and also new technical opportunities. But the impacts are real. We do have power plants that are retiring, a number of them. One of them that is not listed on here, these happen to be Rocky Mountain Power System plants, but we have another larger plant at 1,800 megawatts, the Intermountain Power Project, which predominantly provides energy to California, that we anticipate will be offline by 2027, with an earlier retirement of half of that plant in 2025. So big changes, really, is my message, happening in Utah. Just to further highlight that change, I mentioned the increase in renewables. This is happening fast, just in the last couple of years, adding significant new solar resources, and I'm talking about utility scale solar in this case, and also new wind resources. We also have a vast geothermal resource in our state. We're third in the country, in fact, when it comes to geothermal resources. California and Nevada are first and second, respectively, and we're really small in terms of our current production when it comes to what they're producing. But we do see that as a potential new energy source for the state, and are currently even pursuing an opportunity to host a geothermal lab in our state. I think we're currently one of 2 locations being considered for that. So we really think that renewables are beginning, well, we see that they're playing an increasing role in our energy landscape, and we really see the opportunity for that to continue. Now, I'm talking mostly about utility scale resources, but I would be remiss if I left out what's happening in the rooftop solar industry. Utah has seen unprecedented growth in rooftop solar, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And we do see that those distributed level resources can play an important role as our energy sector changes, but we really have to be mindful of the impacts on the system and potential impacts on affordability. So we'll be considering that as we move forward as a state as well. Again, energy efficiency, really important to Utah. In the 3 years that I've had the current position I hold, we've gone from, I believe, 26th in the country for energy efficiency to 17th. My goal is that within the next year, maybe we can push ourselves to the top 10. So in partnership, in large partnership with our utility, who's looking to meet 88% of new load growth with energy efficiency. So this is just a picture of what's happening in terms of Utah's distributed solar. As my last slide indicated, unprecedented growth, exponential growth in this industry, and concerns from regulators, from the utility about the impacts on the system, on rates paid by other customers. This last year, we did have a discussion over how we were going to continue I'll use the word price, it's a little bit of a misnomer in this instance, but maybe how we were going to continue to credit those who chose to put rooftop solar either on their homes or their businesses. And we entered into a comprehensive conversation with advocates, with the utility, with the solar industry about how we could transition our current practice of crediting 1 kilowatt hour that was produced equivalent to the rate that was paid for 1 kilowatt hour consumed, and moving to what we call a compensation rate. It was very difficult to get to this, but I think everybody in the room recognized that we could create a future together, and one that was better if we worked together than if we engaged in conflict. So I believe the result will be that we will continue to see growth in rooftop solar, and that distributed resources, in other words, resources I'll call more at the local level versus remote resources, will be an increasing part of our energy future. So I think that this is an important slide to show because I've just talked about how our energy mix is changing. Utah doesn't have mandates, and that's another interesting, I think, facet of Utah policy, is we are a state that really is driven by market-based incentives rather than mandates. In 2008, we established a goal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from electric generation sources by 20% by 2025. We are well on our way to get there. We have decreased our greenhouse gas emissions by 14%. Between 2008 and I believe the current estimate is for 2015. I expect if we had data beyond that, given our changing resource mix, that we've accomplished even more than that. So we're certainly set to meet that reduction target. So we think that it's important to be part of what's happening regionally, that we can be part of the regional success story. even if we look, at the world differently in terms of our energy mix, we are going to see plant retirements. We are going to see substantial growth in distributed energy resources, and I apologize for using the acronym. We're going to see an increasing pressure to look at how we plan and operate our transmission system in the face of all of these changes. How are we going to do that together? How are we going to address the need for new storage technologies, and how are we going to integrate when it comes to new technologies like electric vehicles? And you heard the governors talk about that. The world is changing. We're part of what's happening. We want to be part of the dialogue because we think that we really can find solution sets that not only work for our state, but really foster growth, development, and environmental progress in our region. So I just want to close with the goals for our state, because I think that this is really an important thing to state. Utah does have a strategic energy plan. In fact, when Governor Herbert came into office in 2010, it was the first thing that he did. And I believe it was the first comprehensive energy plan in the West. He brought it to Western governors, and you heard today that other states and other governors have picked up this planning process. And that strategic plan is really meant to help us meet our goals as a state and to continue to be flexible in the face of these changes, while at the same time delivering results to all Utahns and to the region. So they're there on the screen. I won't repeat them, but the general idea is to continue to promote development that protects our economic opportunities, fosters innovation, builds our businesses, allows for environmental enhancements, and really realizes our socio-economic goals overall. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. So the first responsibility as the moderator is to end on time, and we got a little bit of a late start, I think, so our time is actually up, and I know that Laura needs to run, so I think we're just going to maybe let you do that as necessary, Laura. Thank you so much for your participation in this conference.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Patrick, and I hope I didn't talk too fast, but I did have a little bit of a time constraint. But it's really my honor to be with everyone here today, so thank you.
Thank you so much. But having said that, we will burn just about 2 or 3 minutes of your break with 1 or 2 questions, if there are any. Yes, sir.
My question has to do with the interface, if you will, between the public, the average person, and the industries, if you will. And I'm looking at the intersection between industry, the public, and legislature, the policy development and that. My question specifically is, you need to bring the public along with you, or is your position, we're going to create the policy through the industry, and then we're going to tell the public what we're doing? I'm not being adversarial when I say that, but it's very comprehensive, very complex. How do you begin to have deliberative democracy, if you will, with the public?
Kathy, and then Jeff, very quickly.
So we always say we don't set the policy. Our regulators, our legislators set the policy. And, we have business objectives, business goals. But if those goals don't align with the policies ultimately that are adopted, then we change our business plans. We also try to maintain very close relationships with a wide group of stakeholders. Our customers, our regulators, our economic regulators, our environmental regulators, legislators. But our job is not to persuade people in as much as provide information and education. Not that people need to be educated, but it's more the informational process. We want to make sure that there's an understanding of what the consequences are of particular pieces of legislation or regulation.
How do you do that?
Outreach?
How do you as a corporation?
Yeah, we do a lot of outreach, particularly on the Pacific Corp side, for example, through the integrated resource plan process. That is an open and transparent process. Anybody who wants to participate, and there are multiple meetings, believe me, you wouldn't want to participate in them all. But, anybody can come. You can join by webcast. You can go in person to either the Salt Lake City or Portland offices. So we have those open, transparent processes. We try to respond because we do some of the scenario analysis that the commissioner was talking about, where if there's a consensus around wanting to run a particular scenario analysis, we do that to try to be responsive.
Thank you, Kathy. And Jeff, very briefly, and then we'll wrap it up.
Quickly, I would add that we need, as both industry that we regulate, as regulators, as policy folks, to realize that the models we've used in the past aren't working anymore, and we need to pick up from the state-of-the-art unregulated entities that understand that you have to segment your customers, you have to use multiple communication channels, and you have to over-communicate. And so we need to figure out what is the message that collectively, with the industry and the regulators and the policy folks, that we're trying to convey that says, A, the world's changing. For some of you, it may not matter. For some of you, it may. Here's ways it may matter to you. Here's ways that we'd like you to get involved in what might matter, starting with some fundamentals that, I was with the co-ops yesterday, the electric co-ops, and commended them on the fact that one thing that's interesting about electric co-ops, a lot of their members are very engaged. They understand their distribution system. They take turns being on the board. They send one of their neighbors to the generation transmission board. So they have a different, I'm overplaying that, but they have an appreciation of some concepts the rest of us still need to communicate out, such as when you are part of a system, there's a cost just to be part of the system, whether it's water or gas or electric or whatever. It's part of socializing that understanding of what these things are, so that when my in-laws moved to California in '79 and there was a water crisis, and so they used a lot less water and then watched their bill go up, why that wasn't unusual to them. How do you help a customer understand that that's part of the economics? So it's a lot of communication, a lot of economics and change that has to be explained to people. And we have to use several channels and realize that it's time to segment out. And I'm just talking about the residential customer segment. That segment is ripe for segmentation into a lot of different groups and moving forward. And I think that'll be part of the solution.
Thank you. Thank you very much for participating.